The F-22 Raptor screamed overhead. The crowd erupted. Children pressed their faces against the chain-link fence. Phones lifted skyward. The smell of funnel cake mixed with jet fuel hung in the Nevada air like a promise of something extraordinary. But nobody was looking at the old man. He stood alone near the vintage aircraft display. His uniform hung loose on his thin frame. The fabric had faded from navy to something closer to gray. Patches covered both sleeves, dozens of them, stitched with threads that didn't quite match. A group of teenage aviation enthusiasts spotted him first. "Look at this guy," one whispered, not bothering to lower his voice, "playing dress-up at an air show." The others snickered. Their smartphones came out. The old man didn't turn around. He kept staring at the P-51 Mustang behind the rope barrier. His weathered hands gripped a small American flag. "Dude, those patches are falling apart," another kid said, zooming in with his camera. "This is going straight to TikTok." The patches were indeed worn. Some hung by single threads. Others had been resewn so many times the fabric puckered around the edges. One near his shoulder bore the ghost outline of letters too faded to read. A middle-aged woman with her family joined the growing cluster of onlookers. "Honey, don't stare," she told her son, but her own eyes lingered on the man's appearance. Some people just can't let go of the past. The old man's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. He took a step closer to the Mustang. The morning sun caught the propeller blades, casting shadows across his face like prison bars. "Hey, Pops," one of the teenagers called out. "Did you get those patches at a garage sale?" Laughter rippled through the small crowd. The old man's flag trembled in his grip. "What's going on here?" The voice cut through the laughter like a blade. Sharp. Military. Everyone turned. A man in Air Force dress blues approached. Colonel's eagles gleamed on his shoulders. His chest bore ribbons that spoke of actual service, actual sacrifice. "Nothing, sir," one of the teenagers mumbled. "Just this old guy with the fake patches." The colonel's eyes found the elderly man. They locked gazes across the small crowd. Something passed between them. Recognition. Understanding. The teenagers shifted uncomfortably. The woman pulled her family closer. "Fake patches?" The colonel stepped forward. His voice carried the authority of someone who'd given orders at 30,000 feet. "Son, do you know what you're looking at?" The teenager shrugged. "Some costume party reject?" The colonel's face hardened. "That man," the colonel said, his voice rising so the growing crowd could hear, "is wearing patches most of us will never earn." He pointed to the faded insignia on the old man's left shoulder. "That's a 332nd Fighter Group patch. The Tuskegee Airman. Do you know what that means?" Silence. "It means he flew when black pilots weren't supposed to exist. When people said his kind couldn't handle a P-51. When every mission was a chance to prove an entire race belonged in the sky." The old man's shoulders straightened slightly. The colonel continued. "And that one there." He gestured to another patch, this one barely hanging on. "That's from the 99th Fighter Squadron, the Red Tails. They escorted bombers over Europe, never lost a single one." Murmurs spread through the crowd. Phones that had been ready to mock were now recording something entirely different. But the colonel wasn't finished. "There's something else," the colonel said. "Punk on." He turned to address the old man directly. "Sir, would you mind showing them the patch on your back?" The old man hesitated. His free hand moved to his shoulder, as if to shield something from view. Please, the colonel said softly. They need to see. Slowly, the old man turned around. On his back, barely visible through decades of wear, was a patch unlike the others. This one was different, hand-stitched, personal. It showed a P-51 Mustang with a name painted on the side. Sweet Caroline. A woman in the crowd gasped. That's the plane right there. Everyone turned to look at the Mustang behind the rope barrier. Sure enough, painted in faded letters on the nose, Sweet Caroline. But that's impossible, someone whispered. That plane's been in museums for 70 years. The colonel smiled grimly. Sir, would you like to tell them? Or should I? The old man turned back to face the crowd. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of decades. I didn't just fly Sweet Caroline, he said quietly. I built her. The crowd stirred. 1943, Tuskegee Army Airfield. I was 19, mechanic first class. Every rivet in that engine, every wire in that radio, my hands put them there. He looked at the plane with eyes that suddenly seemed much younger. But that wasn't enough. They needed pilots. The war was getting worse. So I applied for flight training. They said no. Said mechanics should stick to wrenches. His voice grew stronger. I applied again. No. Applied a third time. They finally said yes, but only because we were losing too many pilots. Only because they were desperate. The teenagers had gone completely quiet. First day of flight training, the instructor looked at me and said, Boy, you'll never fly my planes. Said I could barely read, let alone handle a fighter. The old man's eyes found the colonel's. I was the first mechanic turned pilot in squadron history, and Sweet Caroline was my bird. The crowd had tripled in size. Word was spreading through the air show. People abandoned funnel cake stands and souvenir booths to listen. Tell them about the missions, the colonel prompted gently. The old man nodded. 57 combat missions over Europe. Every time we went up, we brought our bombers home. Every single time. He pointed to different patches on his uniform. This one's from our first mission over Italy. Lost 2 planes, but no bombers. This one's from D-Day. We flew cover for the landings. This one, his voice caught slightly. This one's from the mission where we lost Jimmy Peterson. Good kid, 20 years old. A child in the crowd tugged on her mother's sleeve. Mommy, what's he talking about? The mother knelt down. He's talking about saving lives, honey. About being brave when nobody believed in him. The old man heard this. He looked at the little girl. That's exactly right, young lady. Every patch tells a story. Every thread represents someone who came home to their family because we did our job. But there's more, the colonel said. Sir, tell them about after the war. The old man's expression grew complicated. After the war, nobody wanted to hire black pilots. Airlines said thanks, but no thanks. Military said we'd served our purpose, so I went back to being a mechanic. He gestured toward Sweet Caroline. When they retired her in 1947, I was the one who prepared her for storage, drained her fuel, preserved her engine, wrapped her propeller. I was the last person to touch her before she went into the warehouse. The crowd absorbed this in stunned silence. For 30 years, I worked at a garage in Detroit. Changed oil, fixed transmissions. Nobody knew I'd flown fighters in combat. Nobody cared. A voice from the crowd. What about the plane? What happened to Sweet Caroline? She sat in storage for decades. Government warehouse in Arizona. Forgotten. Just like most of us. The colonel stepped forward. But that's not the end of the story. In 1985, the colonel continued, The Smithsonian started a program to restore Tuskegee Airman aircraft. They needed someone who knew these planes inside and out, someone who understood every bolt, every system. The old man smiled for the first time. They found me through veteran records, called me up and said, "We need your help." I thought it was a prank. He looked at Sweet Caroline with pure love. I spent 5 years restoring her. Every weekend, every vacation day. My wife thought I'd lost my mind, but I had to bring her back. She deserved to fly again. The crowd leaned in. The day they fired up her engine for the first time in 40 years, I cried like a baby. That Merlin V-12 sounded just like she did over Berlin. A teenager, one of the original mockers, raised his hand hesitantly. Did you ever get to fly her again?" The old man's eyes twinkled. "Son, who do you think flew her here?" The crowd erupted in gasps and applause. "Ladies and gentlemen," the colonel announced, his voice carrying across the air show grounds, "meet Colonel William Sweet Caroline Washington, Tuskegee Airman, combat veteran, test pilot, and at 91 years old, still flying." The applause grew thunderous, but Colonel Washington held up his hand for quiet. "Those patches you were laughing at? Each one represents a mission completed, a life saved, a barrier broken. This one," he touched a particularly worn patch near his heart. "This one I sewed on myself the day they told me black men couldn't be fighter pilots." He looked directly at the teenagers who had mocked him. "I've been wearing these patches for 78 years. Through combat, through rejection, through decades when nobody wanted to remember we existed. Some threads have broken, some colors have faded, but every patch stays on." His voice grew softer, but somehow carried further. "Because they're not just patches, they're promises kept. They're proof that when people said we couldn't, we did anyway. They're evidence that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they refuse to give up." The teenage boy who had suggested TikTok stepped forward. His face was red with shame. "Sir, I'm sorry. I didn't know." Colonel Washington studied him for a long moment. Then he unpinned a small American flag from his chest, not the one he'd been holding, but one sewn into his uniform. "Son, now you do know. And knowing means you're responsible for remembering." He handed the flag to the boy. "Don't apologize to me. Apologize to every person you've ever judged by appearances. Then promise you'll do better." The boy nodded, unable to speak. As the crowd began to disperse, people lingered. They approached Colonel Washington with handshakes, hugs, questions about his service. Children asked to touch Sweet Caroline's propeller. Parents explained to confused toddlers why everyone was crying. The colonel who had first confronted the mockers remained beside Colonel Washington. "Thank you for letting me help tell your story, sir." Colonel Washington chuckled. "Son, that wasn't my story. That was our story. Every person who's ever been told they don't belong, who's ever been judged by their appearance, who's ever had to prove their worth over and over again." He looked out at the crowd, at the mixture of young and old, all races, all backgrounds. "Those patches are just fabric and thread, but what they represent, that's eternal. That's the promise that we keep fighting, keep believing, keep proving that everyone deserves a chance to soar." The F-22 Raptor made another pass overhead. This time, Colonel Washington looked up and saluted. The teenagers who had mocked him stood nearby, silent and thoughtful. Their phones were put away. Their eyes were on the sky. Later, when people shared their videos and photos from the air show, The most viewed content wasn't the modern jets or the aerobatic displays. It was a 91-year-old man in a faded uniform, standing beside a restored P-51 Mustang, teaching a generation about the true meaning of service. The patches on his uniform still hung by fraying threads. But now everyone understood they weren't falling apart. They were holding together everything that mattered. And in the comments section of every video, the same message appeared over and over. I will never judge someone by their appearance again. The old man's work was complete.